Mauritius. I'm not entirely sure if I've been conquered by Mauritius, but I certainly enjoy it every time I'm here. At the turn of the millennium, the Doha Development Agenda promised a WTO round that would address and reflect the needs of developing countries. But it never happened, for a variety of reasons. So we're now well past Doha. But that doesn't mean that a lot has not happened. In fact, quite a bit has happened, including on the trade agenda and the trade environment. So my talk will be about a number of features of what has happened from the perspective of sub-Saharan Africa over, roughly speaking, the last 10 years. And I'll focus on three broad issues. The first one is the trade environment itself. What's been happening to trade preferences, in particular trade preference erosion, the effect of China, which has been important, though I feel in some cases its general importance for sub-Saharan Africa has been exaggerated to some extent. It's important for certain countries, but not for many, in terms of exports. And also a bit of the context of what's been happening to global commodity prices. Then I'll discuss a little bit about economic partnership agreements between the sub-Saharan Africa and the EU, although they're between ACP countries and the EU might focus on Africa. Again, that's something that was promised in 2000. It still hasn't quite happened, but it's still a major issue on the agenda for individual countries and in terms of relations with the EU. I'll then have some comments about FDI, foreign direct investment in sub-Saharan Africa, and in particular why the benefits of FDI in Africa have been few and far between. It hasn't delivered what was often expected, and I think there are reasons for that. And I'll conclude with some of the implications for policy strategies at the moment. Well, as we're all aware, it's a difficult environment at the moment. And this afternoon, I'll leave most of the comments about the current crisis to this afternoon. But just want to make two observations. The first, as will be known by anybody who's read the Rogoff and Reinhardt book, these crises are not new. Debt crises are regular occurrences. And also, in that context, crises within the WTO are nothing new. They're features of the history of the whole of the WTO, is that each time you're trying to negotiate a new agreement, the agreement breaks down, it gets stalled, there are difficulties, there are crises, people are concerned about the whole system collapsing, but they muddle through. And often that's the way politics operate. People muddle through. Which does make me wonder why economists build so many of their models based on rational actors, but we know that there is nothing obviously rational about these actors. They muddle through subject to constraints. And that's the environment in which trade policy occurs. But there's another feature of the recent change that I want to emphasize, and that is that the last decade has been pretty good for sub-Saharan Africa. Growth rates in sub-Saharan Africa have been respectable. In fact, they've been a lot better for the continent compared to previous decades. And they've also been better than most of other regions in the world, except for East Asia and China in particular. Even in the kind of peak of the impact of the crisis in 2009, when the developed countries, and hence the world economy, declined, sub-Saharan Africa still maintained a little growth, but it bounced back reasonably quickly. So the last decade has been in terms of African growth has been good compared to previous decades of African growth, and it's been good relative to most other regions of the world. And that's important. And it's not simply a China effect. It makes them better able to ride out storms in global markets. So for Africa, the times really are changing, and policy needs to respect and take that into account, and continue to do the things that they have been improving, and stop doing the things that have always been going wrong. The environment of trade preferences is also changing. Now, preferences have been around for a long time. They've been researched a lot. And the general consensus is that broad-based preferences have had very limited effect on export. So schemes like the generalized scheme of preferences, there's very little evidence that they have an impact. But targeted preference schemes have been more effective. The type of targeted schemes in particular, you could think of NOME, or if we're talking about the agreements between the preference that the EU gives to ACP countries, and more recently, AGOA, like the preferences in the United States. Those targeted preferences are beneficial, but the benefits tend to be very concentrated. They're concentrated in a few countries, and often in a few products. So EU preferences have been particularly important for countries that export sugar or bananas to the EU. And as the Minister mentioned, Mauritius and sugar has gained some of those benefits. Bananas are more important for Caribbean countries. While these countries have benefited, there's a lot less evidence that these are sustainable benefits. It's not generally been the case that domestic industries have developed to avail of access to the US. More frequent, particularly in countries like Kenya and Lesotho, is foreign investment has come in, essentially repackaging, or with a limited value added to export to the US. And that doesn't generate a sustained benefit to these countries. So, targeted preferences, yes, they've delivered some benefit, but they've been concentrated in a few countries, and they've been concentrated in a few products. They have not, in general, supported diversification. So, one implication of that is the environment of preference erosion, again, which the Minister mentioned in his talk. Preference erosion has been going on as the multilateral trade environment of countries reduce tariffs, then preference margins inevitably get reduced. But because the benefits of the preferences have been contemplated, the costs of preference erosion are also quite concentrated. There's only a relatively few countries that are vulnerable to high costs. Some of them, and Mauritius is one example, have planned for that eventuality and have responded quite effectively. But it's also true that among those countries that are affected, sub-Saharan African countries lead the most. Of the 13 least developed countries that are most affected by preference erosion in agricultural products, 10 of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. Of the 13 least developed countries that are most affected by preference erosion in manufacturing products, or non-agricultural more generally, 7 are in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, partly that features, and that reflects, the concentration of production and exports in Africa more in agricultural products than in manufacturing. The limited diversification of African countries in general. So reference erosion is ongoing, it will continue, but the costs are concentrated. And we can identify which countries will be most effective so that they can try to plan for it. Another feature of the last decade has been the global rise of China, and that had an important impact on a number of sub-Saharan African countries. But as I'll illustrate in a moment, the export benefits are largely concentrated in just 8 countries. And they happen to be the countries that export the particular mineral commodities, especially oil, and for example copper and some other metals, that are demanded by China. The majority of African countries have not derived an export benefit from China. But they have faced increased competition from imports from China. You could take an extreme view that China can produce most of the consumer goods that African countries need at a lower price than those countries can produce those goods themselves. So import competition from China is a challenge to many countries. And the final point I'll just observe is there's a backdrop to this about what will happen with commodity prices. So in terms of Chinese exports to China, I just illustrate there that 8 countries account for over 90% of African exports to China, and Angola, South Africa, and Sudan account for the vast share of that. So the export benefits are very, very concentrated. Significant to those countries, but otherwise very concentrated. The last 5 years in particular, the focus on here, have been, we could say, interesting in terms of commodity prices. The minerals, and that is to a large extent a global China effect, is increased demand for the volume of its demand for mineral imports has affected both the volume and world prices. So although, again, we see a dramatic decline in 2009, and a kind of gradual decline, slow down the rate of increase in prices in 2008, overall, mineral prices are doing quite well. But also the tropical commodities, products like cocoa, coffee, tea, they've been doing reasonably well. And they're important for a larger number of African countries. It matters a lot to the majority of African countries what happens to the prices of soft commodities, agricultural commodities. And in general, those have held up reasonably well. Food is the more problematic because, as evident here, we saw a very large food price hike in 2008, and we're going to see another one over the next 6 to 10 months, possibly even more severe than 2008. Now, for countries that are food exporters, that's okay. It's even beneficial, but very few African countries are net food exporters. So that's going to represent a big challenge. For the net food importers, there's going to be another huge problem. In the medium to long term, perhaps there will be one benefit from that. It is increasing realization in sub-Saharan African countries that they really need to get their act together on their own agricultural policy. That's been, in my view, one of the greatest, if not the most critical failures of economic policy in Africa, is that many of the countries should be producing a lot more food. but through a series of policy failures, some of them because of bad advice from the World Bank or even economists at some stage, others because of bad policy. They haven't realized those benefits. Well, repeated food price hikes in an environment of concern for higher food prices may encourage them, and hopefully it will encourage them, to improve their own agricultural policy. And the other interesting one, I suppose, is the crude oil prices. Again, it depends on whether you're an exporter or an importer, but the majority of African countries are importing oil. So, one effect of the global crisis is the rate of increase in oil prices has declined. In fact, real prices have probably declined a bit over the last few years, slightly, and that's the benefit of those countries that are importing. So, you can't really talk too much about trade without keeping in mind what's happening to the commodities that we make in trade. Now, to the extent that the EU is considered an old friend, it may still have something to offer. I'll go a little bit quicker here over the economic partnership agreement. It's a topic that I'm aware I can talk too long, and I've got limited time. The main point to make is it offers benefits and it also offers challenges. The essential effect of economic partnerships, and I'm assuming, although again negotiations have stalled, countries are still progressing that way, the EU is still committed. The main implication is it asks the ACP, in this case the African countries, to eliminate tariffs on substantially all imports of the EU. In return for that, they'll get improved access to the EU market. They already have significant preferences in the sense of zero tariffs. The potentially large impact of the EPAs is to alter the non-tariff terms of access. And in particular, the proposals represent far more favourable rules of origin regimes. And that could have a significant impact. In fact, as tariff preferences are eroded, what one sees and what one would expect to see is increasing use of non-tariff barriers, in particular standards and rules of origin. So that's where the improved terms can be quite significant. But many of the African countries have always been concerned about, well, if we eliminate tariffs on imports to the EU, that's going to be a problem. We'll be flooded with cheap imports to the EU, and that will undermine domestic production. Well, in general, that's not unlikely. Because if you look at individual countries and products, there are relatively few where the EU is a direct competitor with domestic producers. And given that a range of products can be excluded from liberalisation of the agreement, the sensitive products, one could deal with that problem. The more general problem, the more general benefit to the countries is there are consumption gains from cheaper imports. There are welfare gains from cheaper import for efficient producers. And it maintains preferential access. So there are benefits. There are costs in import competing producers. There will be tariff revenue losses. You need to have a plan for tax substitution. But again, in principle, that's achievable. And any trade economist would always argue that, well, you should be getting rid of tariffs anyway. You want to have a tax, they're one of the worst ones to have. There are potential adverse impacts on intra-regional trade, but as I'll discuss in a moment, they can be addressed. There may also be what we call trade diversion effects, as imports from efficient producers in the rest of the world are displaced. But that's, in many respects, that's a notional effect. And again, it depends on particular products and distribution. The core point I just want to make is that if African countries remain or continue their commitment to EPAs, then what they should do is design them in such a way that they actually promote intra-regional trade. And that's an easy argument to make in negotiations with the EU, because that was one of the intentions of the EU through economic partnership agreement.